Hello and welcome to the second of our revision videos on crime and punishment. Still looking at the medieval period from around the year 1000 to 1500, but this time we're very much focusing in on how laws were enforced and how criminals were punished. We have three distinct areas that have responsibility for enforcing law. You've got the king and the nobleman, the hierarchy, the ruling authority. You've got the church, who would take responsibility for moral crimes and heresy. And you've also got the local community. And there was an expectation that local communities would play a big active role in enforcing the law and take that kind of collective responsibility idea. Being loyal to your community was seen as a duty. By the 10th century, English shires had been divided into much smaller areas called hundreds. Every hundred was divided into 10 tithings. All of the men over the age of 12 in a tithing were responsible for the behaviour of all the others. One man from each tithing and one man from each hundred would meet regularly with the king's shire reeve to prevent crime, particularly cattle theft, in their communities. And the whole community was responsible for tracking down those suspected of crimes. Anyone who witnessed a crime could raise a hue and cry. Literally, they were a shout for help. And everybody who heard that hue and cry was expected to help chase and capture the suspects. The church played a big part in deciding whether somebody was guilty or innocent. Oaths were considered to be very, very important, and Anglo-Saxon justice relied very heavily on religion to decide on guilt or innocence. In public hearings, usually in the church with the priest and members of the local community around, those accused of a crime would be asked to swear their innocence under oath. That might be putting their hand on a Bible, it might be putting their hands on some religious relics, bones of a saint, for example. And these oaths are taken extremely seriously. These people are very, very devout religious people. They won't lie to God. And if somebody would swear their innocence under oath, most times they'd be allowed to walk free. And in small, tight-knit communities, it would be very hard then for a criminal to get away with a repeat offence. Think about continuity and change. Today, in a trial, anyone who gives evidence is asked to swear an oath that they will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. In some cases, there wasn't enough evidence to prove that a person was guilty, and in those cases, the church would come into play again because they would organise a trial by ordeal. And this was a way of testing whether the accused was innocent or guilty in the eyes of God. Trials by ordeal included trials by hot iron, hot water, or cold water. Heat was used to burn one of the accused hands, which was then bandaged. If the burn healed well, this was seen as a sign that God judged that person to be innocent. In a cold water ordeal, the accused was thrown into water with their arms tied. Anyone who floated was judged guilty, while anyone who sank was judged innocent and hauled up again. An innocent person who sank had been accepted by the water as pure. For some crimes, including petty theft, the church advised maiming. The belief was that, unlike execution, this type of punishment gave the criminal time to seek forgiveness from God. And so corporal punishment was used quite frequently. That could include eye gouging, removing a hand or a foot, or spending time in the stocks or the pillory. So they'd have that combination of physical pain and discomfort, but also public humiliation. Murder was sometimes punished by fines paid to the victim's family. The fine was called the weregild, which literally translates as a man's price. And this was introduced to reduce blood feuds. The weregild was paid directly to a victim's family, and the fines payable were decided by social status. So a prince would be worth 1,500 shillings, a yeoman farmer 100 shillings, a serf 40 shillings. Presumably teachers would be worth 10,000 shillings, I suspect. The big change, the thing that really affects England, is the Norman conquest, which begins in 1066 and really over the next 20 years transforms life for most people living in England. William I was determined to assert his royal authority, and a stronger, more centralised approach to crime and punishment took effect. William faced rebellions in York and in East Anglia, and so ordered extreme punishments for the rebels, and also punished a large group of people who were not directly involved to show his power, so farmland was destroyed. William and his supporters started a massive programme of castle building. The castles were designed to keep a very careful watch on communities and to look intimidating, and they represented the increasingly strong royal authority over law and order in England. Go look at Launceston Castle or Restormel Castle for examples of that. The northern system of punishment continued to rely on a combination of physical punishments, fines and execution. The weregild was ended, and fines were now paid to the king's officials instead of to victims of crime and their families. This Norman system of law and order was based on the idea that all men should expect to be safe from crime and to live peacefully in and around their homes under the authority of the king. And this was called the King's Mund. And this kind of shows some continuity with the Anglo-Saxon idea of the king's peace. There was also an increase in the number of crimes that were punishable by death or mutilation. Under the forest laws, poaching was punishable by death, and many people at the time viewed the severity of these punishments as unjust. Under Norman law, trial by ordeal continued, but the Normans also introduced a new type of ordeal, trial by combat, and this was sometimes used to settle disputes over larger sums of money or land. The two people involved in the dispute would fight using swords or sometimes sticks, and usually the fight was to the death. Wealthy people could be allowed to pay somebody to fight for them. So one of their soldiers or a knight, for example, might step in and do the job for them. Normans changed law enforcement in other ways as well. Local collective responsibility for preventing crime and apprehending suspects continued. Every male over the age of 12 had to belong to a tithing, and if one member of a tithing was accused of a crime, the rest of the group were expected to find that person and take them to the authorities. Hue and cry was still in use, but all villages now had to hunt suspects down and deliver them to justice. In the later Middle Ages there were some more changes in the 13th and 14th century. Growth of towns like London mean there are far more opportunities for crime, and a more centralised approach was now needed to control crime, and the role of government began to increase. There's a shift away from local communities dealing with crimes in their area towards a system where crime was dealt with by government-appointed officials. Similar law enforcement methods began to be used across different areas. Some older approaches remained in use too, so people were still expected to play a part in apprehending offenders. For less serious crimes, older Anglo-Saxon practices continued. Manor courts had long been used to deal with disputes between the lord of the manor, and local officials who used to be known as tithing men now came to be known as constables, moving closer to today's definition of police constable. Anglo-Saxon community-based policing was gradually changed. Hue and cry was kept, but with some changes. So towns were now subdivided into wards, and two new official roles were introduced, the coroner and the justice of the peace. In the year 1194, King Richard I introduced coroners to deal with situations where there was a suspicious death. He also, in 1195, appointed some knights as keepers of the king's peace in areas that were seen to be particularly unruly and where it was difficult for the community alone to maintain law and order. Nearly 200 years later, in 1327, Edward III extended that system to all areas, and by 1361 those knights were being now known as Justices of the Peace, JPs, a title which still exists today. And those JPs would meet 4 times a year to carry out their magistrate duties and enforce the law. And these men are appointed by the central authority of the king. And this is an important shift towards a crime and punishment system which is imposed by a central government power base. Punishments continued to rely on a mixture of fines, corporal punishment and execution. A significant new punishment was introduced for the most serious crime of high treason, and that was hanged, drawn and quartered. The convicted person would be semi-strangled, then revived, have their abdomen cut open and their intestines drawn out. For most of that process they would still be alive. After death, the limbs would be severed and transported to different areas of the country for display, making a terrifying deterrent to other people. That brings us up to the 1500s and concludes the first section of the Crime and Punishment Notes. Please go check on Edmodo. You'll find PowerPoints and some written notes on there as well, and hopefully some links to some podcasts that you can listen to too. I hope you found this useful and it's helped with your revision. Thank you very, very much.